So for our last lecture, in fact our last lecture for the whole class, we're going to talk about the last heir of Rome. So this other aspect of an empire that emerges from the ashes of the classical Roman Empire is looking at Islam and the Islamic world of its time. So we have to look at the pre-Islamic Arabia and what emerges from this Arabian Peninsula to form a world religion that still is a big part of the world relations today, is it not? And we have a view of the Islamic world, of Islam, of Muslims in Western culture, and as Americans, that, you know, sometimes people don't realize that Americans are Muslims, but the media portrays Islam in a certain way, that portrays it as certain forces. And just like everything out of this class, when we looked at cavemen and the stereotypes, we looked at different things, same with Islam. And we have to understand where it comes from, how it emerges as a major religion, and what are some of the tenets of Islam from its beginnings historically that creates an identity that we still see today. So to begin, this is a picture, this is an image that some of you might be familiar with, those millions of people there in Mecca. And at the center of this, they're all praying. These are all Muslims who are praying specifically at what? This building right here, this cube, is called the Kaaba. The Kaaba is a major point of this, and it's part of the huge legacy of what's happening here, of identity of Islam, and also the pre-Islamic traditions in this area. It's all part of identity that comes out of the region, and that's what we're going to talk about and briefly here today. So, the study of Arabian Peninsula before Islam, there's two huge important factors. One reason is historical agency. What factors helped to create this world religion to arise? So despite of your views of what you think of Islam today, it's an important thing for everybody to understand for historical factors of what creates this world religion to arise. Also, conflict or contribution. Was Christianity always a rival? Today we kind of see it as butting heads with Islam. As a state of conflict. Has it always been a state of conflict with Muslim world? Today's events, you might see that in one way or another, but is there any point where it's not the case? Now, again, if you look biblically, if you're a Christian and you look in Genesis, there's reason to believe that from the beginning with Abraham and having relations with his wife's servant, Hagar, and then having a child, Ishmael, that is written in the Bible of a Christian perspective as being the foundation of this conflict. And that gives rise to Islam. And you can read that in Genesis. On Islam, the Islamic side, they do believe in Abraham. And they believe that at that point, and this is the foundation in the Quran, that Abraham left Sarah and left his son Isaac to be with his servant Hagar, and to be with his son Ishmael. And I put this picture here because in the Quran, if you're a Christian, you might be familiar with the story of Abraham who brought his son Isaac to the top of the mountain to sacrifice him to the Lord. And at the last minute, the Lord said, no, you do not have to do that. And it was symbolic of what was to come between God and Jesus. So there's also a lot of Christian symbolism happening with that story. In Islam, they have the same story, but Abraham did not take his son Isaac to the top of the mountain, but he took his son Ishmael. So there's important, very at the foundation, there's an important difference of situational stories of individuals. So these are Abraham religions, both Christianity and Islam, but also Judaism, that all play together, but with very fundamental differences in ideas of identity of peoples. It creates a huge shift from the very foundation to today. So again, going back to world systems theory, I talked about last time, but I just really briefly in the last video, but I want to talk about it briefly here, where you have core. Remember I talked about Roman Empire, the core being Rome itself, and then the periphery, the whole lands on the outside. The last heirs of Rome, when you look at Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, the core being what? Constantinople, right? And the rest of the empire being its periphery, but the center of it being there. That is a whole world systems theory by this man, Immanuel Wallerstein. So ancient Rome, or the classical Rome here, its core being Rome right there. I want to talk about today, on the fringe of all this, another split, if you will, of the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, that starts to emerge in this classical period. And on between these two empires here, this is the Arabian Peninsula. This is where Islam gets its birth. And it's in this interesting struggle, this sort of juggling of itself as part of the world system of exchange, as part of the Silk Road coming over, and being part of the Byzantine Empire and this Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, both influencing what happens in this area. This is a major strategic point, major point for trade, for influence, for both these empires, and this is where Islam comes out of the split, once again, of the Roman Empire, creating the Persian Empire, Byzantine Empire, creating Western Europe, and then what's going to create an Islamic world that's going to take over all this Persian Empire, and it's going to take over all of North Africa, and in fact into Spain by the year 711. So you have this trade network that we've talked about with disease coming through and trade, and that at the end of the line it goes through the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire, and also Byzantium. But here's the Arabian Peninsula, and here's, look, there's the Kaaba right there. The homeland of Islam in this Arabian Peninsula being major caravan route for both those empires, through Mecca and Medina and all these other places that will take them to the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, into Egypt, to North Africa, but also connecting to the Silk Road. Not all desert. There were settled Arabs in certain regions, but the ones that weren't settling, these were the ones mainly on the caravan routes, are the nomadic tribe members known as the Bedouins. And the Bedouins, they're fiercely independent, they're very pastoral, they're merchants, they're organizers of these caravans, and this is the people of Muhammad. These are the peripheral, powerful home camps and oases of these people. Very nomadic. On one side you have agricultural, on the other side very pastoral. So the very powerful Bedouin culture being very pastoral, being very organized by camps and oases. They're pagan before Muhammad organizes them. Whereas on the other side you have cities and monotheism, both in the Sassanid Empire and Byzantium. They're very politically fragmented, these Bedouin. This side here is the Bedouin sort of cultures. This side here is the Sassanid and the Byzantine Empire, and how different they are. And then also this being the core sort of ideals, and this being the periphery of these two. Now, before Muhammad and before Islam, the Bedouins were very polytheistic, meaning they had many gods. They culturally borrowed complex gods, different gods. They brought them in. They brought them into the Kaaba. They brought them into that building, the place of religion where you can go and you could pray to whatever god would be most useful to you. They didn't pray to, even though they had a statue in there of Yahweh, of the Jewish God, they didn't pray to him because that wasn't what they needed. They needed some goddess that would protect their camels, bring their camels to water, that would heal their sick. So there was over 600 gods inside the religious house of the Kaaba, where all the people would come together in Mecca and pray, and to look at what would be the best for them. You can see the slight differences from Christianity if you're a Christian, but this is the foundation, and that place in the Kaaba is the foundation of the Bedouin people, the Arab people, and the foundation of Islam today. So, how does this all happen? The messenger and the message. very first and important thing to understand is that Islam, they do not, if you're Islamic, if you're Muslim, you do not pray to Muhammad. Muhammad is a messenger. His message is to reestablish the faith of a monotheistic faith. That was his role. So in that Kaaba, with what has become corrupted with all those gods and over the centuries, by the time of Muhammad, his role was to clean that out, to clean out that culture in Mecca, to get rid of all the other idols, and to reform the Bedouin people, the Arab people, as a monotheistic people, to be the messenger of God to bring monotheism back. Now, there's a long story. His wife Khadijah, who was, you could kind of say, a cougar. I think he was in his 20s and she was in her 40s. His uncle, who became one of the main supporters of Muhammad and his thing, is Ali. When he's elected as the Caliph later on, that is the Shiites, right? So that's where you get the word Shiite. Abu Bakr is his closest friend. What Muhammad does is he has a revelation. He goes onto a mountaintop, and there he is spoken to by an angel. The archangel Gabriel is what it talks about in the Quran. And there he is told that there is no God but God, and that he is the messenger. And that is the first sort of message of Islam. Everyone, and the Azan is what it's called. They say there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger. It's a revelation to submit to God. And that's why Muslim, the word Muslim means a person who submits. And Islam means submission. It's all about submitting to God. And so what they believe, and the difference between Christianity is seen by Islam as a polytheistic religion because of the Trinity. So in Christianity, you have the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. In Islam, they see the Son and Holy Ghost as separate than God. So God there's no God but God. So in their view, that is the difference between Christianity and Islam. That is where Christianity and Islamic view fall short, is because of worshiping or seeing as one both the Holy Spirit and Jesus. Now, that's important because during this time period, there was actually a lot of rivals in the Christian faith about how to deal with the Trinity. So, everything that's happening in the Byzantium world and the Christians sort of, if you look at different debates that are happening about how to deal with the Trinity, all that is trickling into this area of the Arabian Peninsula. And there's lots of evidence to show that Muhammad was interacting with Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians from Byzantium, and all that influenced this formation of Islam. So what Muhammad started to do, and what his followers started to do, was to clean house, restore, just in the post-classical way of doing things, restore the original way that Abraham, they believe Abraham and the way they believe everything was meant to be with the Kaaba and the religions in Mecca. So they cleaned out the Kaaba. They got rid of all the polytheistic religions. They made sure that only this was the main important part of the area. And this was not popular. One thing is it drove out business, right? So this is a place that was getting incredibly rich by the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid Empire, all the Buddhist travelers, all the North African. And by cleaning out the Kaaba, that cleans out the whole sort of formation of commerce of this area. Now, the only thing that was keeping Muhammad alive was his wife, Khadijah. She was a very powerful merchant in her own right. Her and his uncle, Muhammad's uncle, were part of a very powerful tribe, and that tribe was protecting him. When his wife and his uncle died in 620 CE, he then lost his protection, and Muhammad had to flee. And this is when he leaves Mecca. It's called the Hijra in Islamic culture, and he fled to Medina. And you know, in Islam, there's a different year system, and this marks the year 1 when he flees to Medina. And there is where Islam takes root, because who flees with him and who is attracted to him are this new form of believers. The Umma is the cult, the community of believers that forms around Muhammad, and from there starts to create a system of ways of life, of praying, of how to submit to God, and this is where it becomes Muslims. Okay, by the time of Muhammad's death, there's war of holy conquest, there's a jihad. They were able to bring most of Western Arabia under Islamic rule, able to go back to Mecca and force authorities to submit and have Muhammad as the leader, and by 630. So all this starts to take root after 622, when they flee to Medina, and Muhammad and his followers, and then by 630, you get this whole empire of Islamic believers starting to spread and to form a new alliance and new way of this peninsula. From the mid 7th century, so from 630 onward into about 1200, you can say, you can actually say 1492. 1492 is the last sort of drive of Islamic culture out of this peninsula here, which the money used to drive both the Jews and the Muslims out of this region gives the king and queen money to give to Columbus, who then sails the ocean blue and finds America. But that's another story. What we're talking about in 630 in this Arabian Peninsula, fleeing to Medina, coming back to Mecca, and creating an empire. And this purple here is Islamic territory by Muhammad's death. So a huge part of the Arabian Peninsula is under his control. But thereafter, what is known as the Caliphates, those who are successors of Muhammad, the Caliph, and you hear words with the Caliphate today, the Islamic State being a new caliphate. They're going to the memory of what happened after Muhammad and the Islamic expansion after 632. So from 632 to 650, you have an expansion. You have another expansion from 750, and these caliphates create their own Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, this Islamic world in its own right. If you hear words today of IS, Islamic State, what their rhetoric they're talking about is going back to this memory of these early caliphates of interaction and submission to Islam with a one ruler and a one world order. So that's what they're talking about here. That's worth talking about. And they take over the Sassanid Empire, and they create a new sort of rivalry between the Byzantine Emperor. Later on, a rivalry with the Western Europe, which then gets arrived to the Crusades. But that's another story altogether that's coming out of this. The Ummah, this is the important part of the identity. The community of all Muslims around the world are known as the Ummah. It doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter if you're from India, from Myanmar, from China, from United States. You're part of the Ummah if you're a Muslim. This is a new identity that's able to be formed through the faith, right? So you're able to rechange your identity. You could be whoever you are or whatever nationality you are, but you could be part of the Ummah. The first work to unite Jewish groups with Muhammad was trying to unite Jewish groups into this Ummah because they were all part of the same foundation, the same sort of sons of Abraham, if you will. Father Abraham had many sons, if you've heard that song. And that's what Muhammad's trying to work with, and saying that Jewish are part, and hoping that Jews would listen to this new prophet of Muhammad. After Mecca, after Muhammad goes back to Mecca, he sees the Jews as disloyal and starts to expel and eliminate them. So you start to see, right with Muhammad, sort of a conflict with looking at Jews and later with Christians, but still able to have them within the empire. They would be able to remain in the Islamic Empire as being called the Dini, or Dummy, and that's the people that are of the book. So those are the people who are of Muhammad, of Abraham, but not followers of Muhammad, not followers of Islam. And so they had to pay a special tax. So you could be protected under the Islamic world rule, but you would pay a special tax as a Jew or a Christian. So that was part of this world that was forming. The core message, and this talks about in the book, but the very, without getting into too much detail of Islam, the 5 main pillars of Islam. First, to profess that there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. That's the first thing that they proclaim. Also to pray 5 times a day towards Mecca, give generously, to give help to the community and to the needy. That's important to give. To fast during the months of Ramadan. That's the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, which is for self-purification. And then pilgrimage. You should try, if you're able to, once in your life at least, to journey to Mecca. Now, this is an important part for world religion, because anywhere in the world you're able to pick up these core beliefs. And at one point, you don't have to live in the Arabian Peninsula. You don't have to live in Mecca, but you have to try to get there. Still to this day, that is why you see those huge pictures of those people around the Kaaba for the Hajj and pilgrimage to the Hajj. So that's all part of the foundation of this religion. Lastly, I want to focus on the successors of Muhammad, and this is the Caliphates, right? So this is what IS today is trying to play off of, but they're not successfully. This is something completely different. But this is what's happening. So Muhammad's seen as the direct link to God. His community, the Umma, acting under the command of God. So the Umma being Islam, being the followers of Islam, being the Muslims. There's no division between religion and secular affairs. It's all one. And Muhammad is creating that in his rest of his life until his death. His sudden death caused a crisis of who would be the next leader. Some people would argue that it had to be a hereditary line, the people in the life of Muhammad, its actual ancestor of Muhammad. So you have that on one side. You also have those who would elect a leader on the other side, and who would be the closest, who are seen as the closest to Muhammad, but not necessarily a blood relative. And that was seen on the other side. That gives rise to this whole sort of split between Islam that will become known as the Shiites and Sunni. The Sunni being the ones that would be elect from the very beginning. The Sunni were the ones that elected the leader to be Abu Bakr, whereas the other ones wanted it to be the hereditary bloodline of Ali, and that's the followers of Ali, the party of Ali, the Shiites. So that's the other side. Collectively, so under the first caliphate of Abu Bakr, who was elected as the first caliph, he's the one who collected the words of Muhammad. He's the one that collected and started to write down everything into the Quran. The Quran being the administration base of being the main way to follow the words of the life of Muhammad, to submit yourself to God. You don't worship Muhammad, but you would follow him as an example of how best to be a Muslim, how best to submit yourself. The leader of the church becomes the leader of this caliphate and the land around it, and it gives rise to, from 631, the rise of the Umayyad dynasty. This would last from 661 to 750, moving the capital from Mecca to Damascus, as a major center of the hub of this whole world, and made the official caliph even more powerful, forcing tribal leaders to accept and to expand all over. And this is the land from up into Spain, North Africa, that whole Sassanid Empire, all the way buttoned up to India and China, creating this massive empire of the Islamic world. Expansion, unanticipated change, with Uthman in 655 ordering the official edition of the Quran. After that, you get the Abbasid Dynasty. So you get a dynasty that reigns from 750 to 1258, this massive empire, where you get organized from Sharia law with the Islamic law, the rise of, I think you write about the main things which still today, which people look at to how to be a Muslim, is the hadiths. Now, you can look at the Quran as the book, but you can also look at the people who followed and who heard words of Muhammad and who had certain ways of doing things, certain ways to dress, certain ways to act, and they look at certain what are called as hadiths. In many ways in Islam, that's what you look at the most, even more so than the Quran, to dictate your actions, is the hadiths. And this starts to really come about, well, with the Umayyad dynasty, but on the Abbasid dynasty. But within the Abbasid dynasty, and the important thing about this Abbasid dynasty in the times that we have is what is known as the translation movement. And you talk about this briefly in your textbook, and you could write about this as a term in the exam. Where between the years 750 and 1000, there was a major effort with this whole world and the interaction of goods, but remember ideas too. So scholars from all over Eurasia and the Mediterranean were coming together to Baghdad to translate books, to translate ancient books from ancient China and India, from the whole Islamic world of the Middle East now, or the Mesopotamian region, from ancient Greece, from Rome, from all these places coming together and translating books and retaining knowledge of astronomy and medicine and mathematics and geography, you see, technology being built, and this astrolabe here, so people who are far away and don't know which direction to go to pray to, this would allow wherever they are to look towards Mecca. So it's a sort of a compass, an astrolabe, and this was used eventually in navigation in Europe. So and also the different stuff coming from China. So I study medieval paper in Europe, but that paper technology came from China to the Islamic world, and they're translating all this stuff on paper, eventually paper making its way to the Western Europe. Now, some of the works that you might see, one of the best medical books is created in this time period, where you see amazing ways to deal with cataracts and how to be able to take a cataract out of an eye, to deal with different diseases. Here's a picture of a rabid dog that's biting this man, and how do you deal with rabies? So this is all medical things that is way beyond its time than Western Europe's going to be able to get for centuries later. And it all happens through this translation movement of knowledge, showing another aspect of a world system of exchange. So we've seen goods, we've seen power of empires, we've seen disease with Justinian plague, but here's also with the translation movement a transfer and an establishment of ideas, a transfer of ideas that become part of this very advanced Islamic world in these centuries.